Hey, it's Sela Social Studies.
Hey guys, welcome back to Sela Social Studies. Today we're going to be talking about post-World War II politics and what happened at the end of and after World War II. So we have to first start, of course, with the big three. And with the end of World War II in sight, world leaders started to recognize that Europe was going to look a lot different. There were numerous meetings between the quote-unquote big three, which consisted of British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, Soviet leader Joseph Stalin, and President Franklin Roosevelt. In February 1945, they met in Crimea, the Soviet Union, to discuss what Europe's future is going to look like after the war. And in May of 1945, the European theater of World War II ended, and in July of the same year, Churchill, Stalin, and President Harry Truman. At this point in time, it was not President Franklin Roosevelt because Roosevelt died in April of a brain hemorrhage. These three met, the big three again, met in Potsdam, Germany to discuss Japan's surrender and the division of Germany. As a result of the Potsdam Conference, Germany and its capital Berlin was divided into four separate zones, with the zone being controlled by the United States, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union. Stalin also promised the United States that Eastern European countries would be free from oppression and that they would help the United States in its war against Japan no more than 3 months of the war being over in Europe, with the United States giving territorial concessions from Japan and Chinese Manchuria to the Soviets. Both of these statements were lies, but the Soviets still took the land anyway. We also have the Nuremberg trials going on from November 1945 through October 1946, which put high-ranking Nazi officials on trial for their war crimes. With many Nazi officials sentenced to death, some felt that this was justified. Once the Nazi leaders were arrested and war crime trials began, a date would be agreed upon for the election of new German government and the withdrawal of the Allied troops. Stalin, who was determined to create a buffer zone from any other future invasions of the Soviet Union, he placed a faux or a puppet communist regime in Eastern European countries. Soon, the communist governments were aided by the Soviet or the Red Army, and Stalin's control was complete. Now that Stalin was controlling most of Eastern Europe, Winston Churchill remarked that a quote-unquote Iron Curtain has descended across the continent. So how does the United States and other allied powers respond to this? Well, remember that the United States failed to join the League of Nations after World War I. This league was formed to try and prevent all future wars, and after World War II, the United States would not make that mistake again. In 1944, Allied nations met to discuss a new peacekeeping organization, and in 1945, representatives from 50 nations met in Washington, D.C. to write the Charter for the United Nations. The United Nations was formed to resolve international conflicts and prevent another world war from happening. One of the United Nations' first acts of business was to divide Palestine into separate Arab and Jewish states, and in May of 1948, Jewish leaders announced the creation of the nation of Israel for the survivors of the Holocaust. Now we'll move on to the Cold War. In 1945, one major war ended and another began with the Soviet Union. After World War II ended and Stalin attempted the spread of communism, President Truman decided to act. This was not a direct hand-to-hand combat war. There were no direct military campaigns or engagements between the Communist Soviet Union and the Democratic United States. Yet, because it lasted 45 years, billions of dollars and millions of lives were lost during this time we call the Cold War. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill coined the phrase the Iron Curtain. This phrase describes the fictional wall that the Soviet Union put up around its countries. Churchill was stating that this wall divided the communist nations from the rest of the world. The United States became the leader of the free market capitalistic world. America and its allies struggled to keep the communist totalitarian Soviet Union from expanding into Europe, Asia, and Africa. Theaters as remote as Korea and Vietnam, Cuba and Grenada, Afghanistan and Angola became battlegrounds between the two ideologies. One post-war pattern quickly became clear. The United States would not retreat in its former isolationist stance as long as there was a Cold War to wage. The long-term causes of the Cold War are clear. Western democracies had always been hostile to the idea of a communist state. The United States had refused recognition to the USSR for 16 years after the Bolshevik takeover. Domestic fears of communism erupted in a Red Scare in America in the early 20s. American business leaders had long feared the consequences of a politically driven workers' organization, and World War II provided short-term causes as well. There was hostility on the Soviet side as well. 20 million Russian citizens perished during World War II. Stalin was enraged that the Americans and British had waited so long to open a front in France. This would have relieved pressure on the Soviet Union from the attacking Germans. Further, the United States terminated the Lend-Lease aid to the Soviet Union before the war was complete. And finally, the Soviet Union believed in communism. When the Soviet Union entered the war between the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the United States no longer needed their aid, but Stalin was there to collect on Western promises. All these factors contributed to a climate of mistrust that heightened tensions at the outbreak of the Cold War. After the Potsdam Conference ended, Germany was divided among the four powerful Allied nations of Britain, France, the Soviet Union, and the United States. The Soviets ruled the communist East Germany, and the Democratic Allies controlled West Germany. An issue stemmed from what happened to the wartime capital of Germany, Berlin. Berlin suffered the same divided fate of Germany with one profound problem. It was located 100% inside communist East Germany. The capital of Berlin suffered the same fate of Germany. The Allied sections of the capital were known as West Berlin, became an island of democracy and capitalism behind the Iron Curtain. In June of 1948, Stalin decided that he was going to gamble with part of Berlin. He wanted the capital to be communist, and he was testing if the Western powers were willing to go into another war over the communist attempted control of West Berlin. The Soviet Union decided to seal off all land routes that went into West Berlin. Stalin felt that the Allied powers were too exhausted to fight another war and would just surrender West Berlin to the Soviets. However, this would backfire on Stalin. Truman was in a tough position. If the Allies gave up Berlin, it would defeat the whole purpose of containment. If they were to retreat or negotiate, it would show the world that the Soviet Union would be able to imperialize nations and the Allied powers would remain stagnant and therefore weak. To Truman, there was no other answer. The Allied powers would stay in West Berlin, thus starting the largest civilian humanitarian aid effort through the only way possible, the air. Truman showed Stalin that the United States was ready to fight. The decision between war and peace was now Stalin's. With Stalin's refusal to shoot down American planes, he chose against war. For the time being, and Americans and British planes dropped nearly 4,000 tons of supplies into West Berlin. This was to become known as the Berlin Airlift. Stalin grossly miscalculated the strength of Western unity. To display the strong bond between the Allied powers post-World War II, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization was created in April of 1949. NATO was a pact operated on the basis of collective security. If any one of the member states were attacked, all would retaliate together as one force. The original NATO included Britain, France, Italy, the Netherlands, Belgium, Canada, Iceland, Luxembourg, Denmark, Norway, Portugal, and the United States. Don't be fooled by the enormity of NATO. The Soviets and its allies had a similar pact that shared the same principles called the Warsaw Pact. When the Soviets marched on Germany from the west, they absorbed the nearby nations of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania into the Soviet Union. Soon, the Soviet communist forces dominated the governments of Romania and Bulgaria. By the fall of 1945, it was clear that the Soviets had control of Poland, violating the outcome of the Yalta Conference. It was only a matter of time before Hungary and Czechoslovakia fell to the Soviets also. Stalin was now ordering a Soviet-led communistic government to be placed into West Germany. How many countries or dominoes will fall to communism? The United States saw Europe as a destroyed land with people actively looking for any type of support or for a strong government who can promise a better way of life, making these lands ripe for revolutions. Truman was determined to stop communism where it laid. George Kennan, a diplomat in the State Department, proposed a way to combat the spread of communism. It was called the policy of containment. The idea was to try and stop the spread of communism by containing it in a smaller area, not to go to war with the Soviet Union. Since the American people were weary from war and had no desire to send United States troops into Eastern Europe to fight the Red Army, stopping the Soviet Union would have been impossible. Turkey and Greece were the first two countries that were affected by this crisis that had not been taken over by the communist Soviet Union, although both were close to being occupied by Soviet-backed movements. Truman decided that this was enough, and in March of 1947, he asked Congress to appropriate $400 million to send to these two nations in the form of military and economic assistance. Within 2 years, the communist threat had passed, and both nations were comfortably in the Western sphere of influence. Thus, the policy of sending military and economic aid to countries to contain communism within its current borders became known as the Truman Doctrine. In the aftermath of World War II, the European continent was destroyed. The war had ruined crop fields and destroyed infrastructure, leaving most of Europe in dire need. On June 5, 1947, Secretary of State George Marshall announced that the European Recovery Program to aid Western Europe. Marshall announced that the program of sending aid to Western Europe was completely humanitarian to avoid antagonizing the Soviet Union, and even offered aid to the communist states in the East. Congress approved Truman's request of $17 billion over 4 years to be sent to Great Britain, France, West Germany, Italy, the Netherlands, and Belgium. The trade of monetary aid and humanitarian aid for the economic recovery and the containment of communism became known as the Marshall Plan. The Marshall Plan created an economic upswing in Western Europe. Western European countries were producing much more product than prior to the war, and infrastructure was rebuilt. The Marshall Plan was a huge success, and much to Truman's delight, none of these nations of Western Europe faced a serious threat of communist takeover for the duration of the Cold War. The next two things we're going to be talking about is the American economy and the Korean War and Red Scare. I'll see you next time. See you in the Social Studies.